Welcome to Sputnik on this fine Boxing Day, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
He's only the funniest writer in England, writing for the mass circulation Daily Mail, sometimes twice a day, as parliamentary sketch writer of the very first rank.
And he's no mean theatre critic either. So how would he have the time to write a crackling new novel, The Speaker's Wife, and come on board the Sputnik?
Well, we're glad to say he's here now. He doesn't have much time, so let's meet the one and only Quentin Lett. Quentin, a pleasure to have you here at Christmas time.
Very nice to be here.
The Speaker's Wife. Is it biographical?
It is about Parliament, and it's about the Church of England, funnily enough. But there is a character in it who is a speaker, who is a scurvy little so-and-so. And he does have a wife, indeed. But no, it is fiction. And it's about parliamentary corruption, sure. But it's also to do with the cultural decline of traditionalism in Britain today, and a complete lack of self-belief among the traditionalists.
Well, our institutions have lost their credibility.
Now that's not fiction.
That's not fiction. And, you know, the Britain that the outside world sees is a Britain with the royal family and with magnificent buildings and with all the old panoply of empire. But actually, the institutions of Britain today, many of them are, spiritually at least, are husks. And they have lost that self-belief, which was so important.
You are a Christian man, a Church of England man. Once upon a time, Parliament, and indeed the country, was quite identifiably, perhaps hypocritically, but quite identifiably, a Christian country. But even the Christians in Britain are not very Christian anymore, are they?
No, there has been a decline in church-going, certainly in numbers. But I think, on the whole, Britain is still very much a Christian country. It draws its modern understanding of tolerance from old-fashioned Christianity, which wasn't as tolerant, but it takes its creed from that. And my belief, and partly what I'm trying to reflect in this book, is that I think that tolerance and that cultural liberality, the liberal nature of our culture, has been pushed about as far as it can possibly go without it starting to damage itself. And this is being seen I'm not just talking about here the threat from Islamists, but I'm talking about the threat from things like selfishness and the lack of self-discipline and the way that we have, as a country, have lost the idea of community and of social generosity.
Through capitalism, perhaps?
Well, capitalism, to my mind, is a very good thing in many ways. I don't think it's just to do with the nature of wealth creation. It's to do with something deeper inside us.
Greed.
Yes,
that
greed.
Sounds like it.
And I think greed is not necessarily the same as capitalism. So it's to do with the way that we relate to other people, and it's to do with, for instance, the idea that we can just rely on the state rather than relying on society. The state and society are very different things.
Indeed, Mrs. Thatcher, though, the High Priestess, whom I'm guessing you admired.
Up to a point, with limitations there. She was misquoted on that. I think she said there was no such thing as society. Well, she didn't quite say that. It has been taken out of context a little. But she was, I think, trying to get across the idea that just relying on the state, just saying, oh, the state can look after that. That's not good enough. We have to look after things from a smaller level, from our villages and from our towns and from our neighbourhoods.
No, but her lesson from the parable of the Good Samaritan was that the Good Samaritan had made piles of money before he happened upon this poor wretch. Otherwise, wouldn't have been able to help him.
Well, yes. I mean, she was easily caricatured, Mrs. Thatcher. She was not without her faults.
Let's talk about Parliament, because I'm an admirer, of course, of your novels, but your parliamentary sketch writing is peerless. there have been other greats, Matthew Paris, the late and great Frank Johnson.
Bernard Levin was a very good one as well.
I never read him. I'll take your advice and read some of his past columns. But yours is way well up there with these giants. But of course, like every other writer, your material is all you've got to work with. I'm guessing that the infusion of Scottish nationalists, a kind of Highland division, has made the House a bit more interesting for a sketch writer, has it?
It's made it different, and difference is always important for journalists because we like the new. But you don't necessarily need to have a House of Commons full of admirable, brilliant people to make an interesting column. Sometimes failure can be very interesting to write about and funny to write about. And what one tries to do as a sketch writer, and I think it's a journalistic genre particular to Britain, you try to drill down into the character of the people who are passing the laws. And so if those people happen to be inadequate or lazy or downright stupid, then, you know, that can give you...
That's just as interesting
as to have
even more so.
a house full of Ciceros.
So it was a quite tumultuous year with the general election, the re-election of the Tories, and then the Labour leader election. What was your highlight within Parliament?
Well, I think the arrival of Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour leader, the leader of the opposition in Britain, has been very interesting because he is not your off-the-peg, modern, photogenic, soundbite politician. And, I mean, I think he's doing terrible things to the Labour Party, which sadly enough. But, you know, it's certainly interesting to see that as the theatre of politics.
Yeah, because you see it all from above happening.
Yes, and it's also been, you know, it's been unexpected. And go through that again, you know, is very interesting. But one of the highlights, which I'm sure George would not have enjoyed, was the speech of Hilary Benn about the bombing, about taking whether or not Britain should join the bombing action over Syria. And that was really interesting because there you had the internal party dramas which were played out in front of us of Hilary Benn, who is the Labour Foreign Affairs spokesman, making a speech. Next to him, his party leader, disagreeing with everything. And that was fascinating to see that being played out on the stage of the House of Commons.
It was extremely dramatic. As a piece of oratory, I didn't actually think much of it. And
well, it was well delivered, George. It was badly written. It was nothing as a piece of work. It didn't have interesting words.
No.
But he delivered it in a way that was, first of all, it was great because it was unexpected from him. Mm-hmm. And he's really not until now had given us any idea he could do that. But also he turned to his own benches and delivered the speech to his own riven party. And that's what made it.
It's funny, in reverse, I don't know if you were there, it might have been slightly before your time, a man who passed this year, Lord Howe, Sir Geoffrey Howe, as he then was.
I was there in the House on the day.
Now, he didn't deliver it well because he never delivered anything well, but the words were very, very powerful when he made this speech, which effectively ended Mrs. Thatcher's leadership. Now, I was there as a piece of parliamentary drama. That was a truly extraordinary day, wasn't it?
And it was, because in oratory, context is terribly important. You know, you can have the most boring words delivered in a certain context, which can become brilliant, and you can have brilliant words delivered in a boring context, which die. But there was Howe, who was the ultimate mouse, suddenly roared. Yes. And he roared against, there was the impenetrable Mrs. Thatcher, who was suddenly brought down by this unlikely person. And yes, I was there that day. That was one of the early days when I was sketching.
And the great, now also late this year, Lord Healy, Dennis Healy, who was a very big figure in Labour, in government and in opposition, he once said that being attacked by the late Sir Geoffrey was like being savaged by a dead sheep.
Yes, and that was the making of both men in some ways.
Indeed, to some extent. Now, Cameron's back in, looking very
very pleased with himself.
Looking very pleased with himself, very plush. Is he going to last the 5 years, do you think, or will someone like Boris try to overturn him?
I would be surprised if he lasts the whole 5 years, because he has said he's going to go, and the nature of human nature is to want to have someone else will want to take over from him just shortly before the end. I think he's going to have a failure in his negotiations in Europe, and that might hasten, that might bring early and make early his departure, and then there will be a terrible catfight in the Conservative Party to succeed him, and that will, I suspect, do the Conservatives damage, as will the whole European row. So at the moment, there are the Conservatives looking very, very confident. But there are tumultuous times ahead, and this may be seen as the high point of their fortunes.
Indeed, and I wouldn't put money on them winning the European Union referendum, despite all my problems with the Faragists and xenophobes of all kinds.
No, I think
I'll be campaigning for a withdrawal.
You will, will you?
I will, and I think we're currently about 50-50 in the polls. And
yes, and it all
dramatic.
depends. It's caught up with the immigration stuff, which is electric for a large part of the population. Whether or not that part of the population votes may be a different matter.
And of course, if Cameron campaigns to stay in and the vote goes against him and we pull out, especially if Boris has shrewdly positioned himself, what's your take on him? Boris likely to be the next leader?
Everything, when you go around the street with Boris, it is extraordinary to see the reaction of the public to him. The only person who comes close to it, in my experience, is Alex Salmond. If you go out on the street with Alex Salmond, people run up to say hello to him, and it's the same with Boris. So there is an excitement and a hunger in the public for more Boris. But this man, Boris, is not disciplined. He doesn't have the sort of rigour that you need to be a prime minister, the daily grind of leadership. And he's indecisive. And he hasn't made up his mind yet about the European question. If you haven't made up your mind about that yet, this is one of the big questions in British politics, in European politics, then it strikes me there's something wrong with you. And he lacks the seriousness. He's too ambitious in some ways. He's a bit of a goal hanger, as we used to say, the sort of centre-forward who used to stand just near the opposition goal, waiting for the easy goal. Wouldn't do the hard work in midfield.
Quentin Lett, as always, fascinating to hear you. Thank you very much for joining us on the Sputnik. Coming up after the break, it's only Brian Eno. Welcome back to Sputnik. Brian Eno has been a major figure in popular music and culture for most of my life, from Roxy Music to Robert Wyatt, producing albums for Coldplay and U2 when they were great, and much, much else besides.
But his political commitment for justice and peace against war after war have made him stand out from the crowds. He has marched and sung the songs of freedom with millions, many mere children, when he commanded the stage with a synthesizer.
It is an honour, therefore, to have him on board the Sputnik on this Boxing Day. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I know you don't want to talk about your music career, so let me just ask you how you segued, or what made you segue from being such a major rock star to being a person next to us on marches in London. It's not normal.
Well, I always had political interests, and in fact, I was a sort of anarchist when I was a kid, in the old sense of a philosophical anarchist, of thinking, was it possible to run things without governments at all, or what was the minimum amount of government that would be needed? So I was sort of into the theory of politics for a long time, but the action followed, as you say, rather late. So apart from being a student and demonstrating against Vietnam and so on, there was a long period when I wasn't physically involved in anything political. And then when I started to see, after Thatcher really, the end of what they call the golden age of capitalism, I think the period post-war up until Thatcher and Reagan, when I started to see things being clawed back so that workers' rights started to disappear again, welfare started to be shrunk, all the things that had really been the product of, you know, a century of sort of socialistic thinking, actually. When I started to see those eroding, then I became more engaged again.
It was a brief moment of social democracy, really, rather than socialism, from my point of view. It was a very brief period when you think of it.
Yes.
From 1945 to 1979.
Yep, 30 years.
Even in the life of one man or woman, that's not that significant. In the history of a country, it's a mere fraction of a second. And Britain has changed for the worse very considerably since then. But not many people who, I'm inferring from all this stardom that you are comfortably off, not many people who are comfortably off care about that. What's different about you?
Well, actually, I think quite a few people care about it. They don't think that there's much they can do about it, which is slightly different. So they don't get involved. You know, it looks complicated. It's made to look complicated. I think it isn't as complicated as it looks. I think the story has been confabulated so in order to keep you out of it. Actually, it's been made to seem like an area that you couldn't ever approach, you couldn't have opinions about. And indeed, you know, if you see when public figures who aren't politicians get involved in politics, the first accusation they always get, in England anyway, is, what right do you have to talk about this? I've heard this a lot, you know, people saying, what would you know about it? And you think, well, what do politicians know about it? What sources of information do they have that I don't have? Most of the information is available now, actually, so any intelligent person is able to make a judgment. So I think the first thing that I would say to everybody is it's not rocket science, actually. There are some simple social processes going on that we have a right to be involved in and to intervene in.
Well, Brian, you were at the forefront speaking against Israeli oppression in Palestine past year and in the Gaza war 2014. You were, along with some other major stars from Hollywood as well, speaking against the aggression, but some of them paid the price for it, like the actress Penelope Cruz and her husband. How have they... I'm trying to understand that when artists trying to speak against this major issue of the Middle East, the response among your own circles, basically.
Well, again, the first thing that people always say is, what do you know about it? So again, it's turned into a much more complicated story than it is. The story to me is very simple. There's a people that are being colonized, essentially, and their land is being taken from them illegally. That's very simple, and everything seems to grow out of that. But that's constantly denied and hidden within stories of rocket attacks and tunnels and blah, blah, blah. So again, it's made to look too complicated. And of course, I get a lot of reaction from pro-Israeli or pro-Zionist people who say, you have no right to talk about this, or why are you picking on Israel? That's the particularly frequent criticism.
But I think you as well have raised the Israeli-Palestine issue, comparing it with South African apartheid. Do you compare the rise, the voices from the artists against this apartheid to that era?
Yes, I do, and I hope that it will have a similar effect. I mean, I have to say I'm slightly equivocal about the impact of BDS, though I support it. I can also understand why people wouldn't support it and why they would think it's better if I carry on with what I'm doing as an artist, you know. So I certainly wouldn't put pressure on other artists to support BDS. However, as far as I'm concerned, that it's the best thing I can do. To give you an example, poor Roger Waters, who is now being crucified daily for his support of BDS, all over the world, you know, Howard Stern in his terrible radio program is absolutely laying into him with no mercy at all.
Well, this is at least the minimum that you get out of it, the spark that, you know, it excites. Lauryn Hill, for example, was supposed to perform as well in Tel Aviv. And in the end, it was long, she took a long time to consider it, but in the end he decided not to, but was very apologetic about it. And that, this was a lot of response about it, and a lot of people talked about it, and I think that's a good start, no? People start not assume it as normal.
That's absolutely true. I think that getting the conversation going is actually one of the important parts of BDS. It's not only the fact that there's a cultural boycott of some kind, but it's the fact that that makes people start talking about it. So it keeps the issue visible because, unfortunately, what's happening in Gaza, for example, as soon as after a week, it goes off the front pages. So it's always disappearing, but it's always going on.
Yeah.
And it isn't just going on in the sense of missile attacks and air attacks. It's going on in daily kind of humiliations and restrictions on freedom. For instance, I read the other day that the Israelis are now redoing all the road signs in Israel so that they no longer carry the Arabic names of any towns. They now carry the Arabized Israeli names. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It is an extraordinary thing. I read something you wrote that I found very powerful. You made the comparison to the white settler colonization of what is now the United States, usurping the indigenous people, killing a lot of them, pushing them to the margins, and then watching them or not watching them rot in essentially reservations. I was very close for very many years to the late President Arafat, and he used to always insist, we are not the Red Indians, quite a politically incorrect phrase, but you know what he meant. We are not going to go, he used to say, into the museum, like the Indian culture in the United States. But I just wanted to follow something up. I certainly won't name names, but a major rock star of my acquaint was for a time involved with us on Middle Eastern Palestinian matters, and then pulled out. And when I asked them why, they said that the pressure in Hollywood and in the music business and so on, by which they meant the pressure of losing money. Have you ever been subject to that kind of commercial pressure to desist from your criticisms of Israeli crimes?
No, I haven't, actually. But I should say, I think that what's important to most people, most performers anyway, is not the commercial pressure. I don't think it's money they're worried about. I think if you think of the psychology of performers, they're people who like being liked. It matters to you to be liked. And to suddenly get a kind of full-powered hose of vitriol directed at you, and it really is virulent, some of this stuff that comes towards you.
I'll show you my scars.
Yes, exactly. you would know, yeah. It's really shocking, actually. It's very surprising for people who've been used to audiences applauding them, and suddenly to get all of this directed at them. So I think it's really not the money that people are worried about. It's suddenly being the object of public contempt and hatred.
You had a great line at the demonstration outside Downing Street. You said, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's a very, very good line. Tell us what you meant by it.
Well, we, as a nation, we're holding a huge hammer, which we're very proud of, which is our defence structure. We spend billions and billions a year on it, far, far more than people realise, actually. And it's one of our biggest industries. Defence is one of the things that Britain does. In fact, we're one of the top 5 weapons sellers in the world. Very few English people know that. So here we are holding this enormous hammer called weapons. And so whenever there's a problem, that's the first resort to solving it. We don't resort to what we were traditionally supposed to be good at, which was diplomacy. We resort to weaponry. And, because we're in such a close and toxic alliance with America, who has exactly the same philosophy, we double the amount that we do that. So now we pile in with the weapons, and it's such a stupid attempt at a solution. It produces, as we can see from the history of this century, let alone other ones, we can see that it immediately produces exactly the wrong results. And now we're allied with a country in the form of Saudi Arabia, who is our biggest buyer of weapons, actually. That's our biggest customer. So what is the chance that we're going to actually say anything candid to them about the support for ISIS that is coming out of Saudi Arabia? There's no chance. We're trying to fight this war with somebody who's supporting the enemy, you know.
To whom we're selling a lot of weapons, from which we're making a lot of money. And some of those weapons are ending up in the hands of ISIS.
Yeah, yes.
Perhaps many of these weapons.
Apparently a lot of the ISIS weapons are left over from the Iraq war. They've now been sort of repatriated by ISIS and turned against us. No, it's really the wrong, entirely the wrong solution. You know, we've got the hammer, but that isn't the nail. And it's more like trying to hit a piece of rubber. It just keeps breaking and stretching and turning up in other places.
It's a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive.
Yeah.
Brian Eno, it's been a pleasure having you on board the Sputnik. Have a nice time in the rest of the holiday. Alas, that's all we've got time for in the last show of 2015.
But there's more, and you can stay in touch through Twitter on RT_Sputnik and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. Happy Boxing Day from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.